5 years later, restaurants would compete for mushrooms grown from the same sugar mill waste Daniel Harper had once begged the company to stop dumping beside his field. But on the first morning the trucks arrived, none of that seemed possible. Before sunrise, the sound of heavy engines rolled down the dirt road. One truck appeared, then another, each carrying a load of wet, shredded sugarcane bagasse. They stopped beside Daniel's southern field. The beds lifted. Tons of pale, fibrous waste crashed onto the ground. At first, the pile seemed manageable. It sat low behind the fence, giving off a faint, sweet smell. Then the trucks returned the next day, and the day after that. Within weeks, the heap stood higher than the barn roof. The surface dried beneath the sun, but the layers underneath remained hot and wet. Steam rose from the center. After heavy rain, dark liquid ran into the drainage ditch, carrying a sour odor across the fields. Flies gathered. Neighbors complained. Loose fibers blew through the fence and stuck to the damp soil. The sugar mill called it a disposal arrangement. To them, bagasse was simply what remained after the juice had been pressed from the cane. It occupied valuable space, cost money to transport, and had little use in its current form. Daniel saw something different. He saw another problem arriving at the worst possible time. His farm had already been losing ground. The southern field produced less each season. His irrigation pump failed repeatedly. Bank notices were beginning to collect unopened inside a kitchen drawer. Now, beside the last field he still hoped to save, a mountain of industrial waste was growing larger every morning. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped at the fence and stared at the pile. "The mill has turned your farm into a dumping ground." Daniel did not argue. At that moment, he believed the same thing. He saw the odor, the insects, the runoff, the humiliation of watching trucks leave behind something nobody else wanted. Then, after 3 days of steady rain, Daniel walked to the pile to inspect the drainage. Near the base, beneath a layer of darkened fiber, something pale was pushing through. He crouched and pulled the wet bagasse aside. Small mushroom caps emerged from the decomposing cane. Around them, thin white threads spread through the fibers like a hidden web. Daniel stared at the cluster. The mill had removed the sugar. The town had dismissed what remained. But something living had found value inside it. Long before the bagasse began piling up beside his fields, Daniel Harper's farm was already in trouble. For 3 generations, his family had grown corn, beans, and sugarcane on the same land. His grandfather had cleared the first field by hand. His father had built the barn from timber cut near the river. Daniel had inherited more than soil and buildings. He had inherited the belief that the farm must never be sold. But belief did not pay the bills. The southern field had become harder to work each year. The soil was compacted, dry on the surface, and nearly lifeless underneath. Rainwater rushed across it instead of soaking in. Fertilizer prices kept rising, while harvests kept shrinking. Then the irrigation pump failed. Daniel spent nearly all his remaining savings repairing it, only for another drought to arrive weeks later. By the end of the season, his corn stood thin and uneven, with yellow leaves curling beneath the sun. The bank notices began appearing soon afterward. At first, Daniel left them unopened on the kitchen table. Then he moved them into a drawer. He already knew what they said. One more weak harvest could force him to sell part of the land, or lose the farm entirely. His neighbors suggested practical solutions. Lease the southern field. Sell the old equipment. Take the mill's offer and let them use the land for storage. Daniel listened, but every suggestion felt like surrender. At night, he walked through the barn after the animals had settled. The building was quieter than he remembered. Several stalls were empty. Tools that once belonged to his father hung unused against the wall. Outside, the mountain of bagasse continued to grow. To everyone else, it was another burden added to a failing farm. To Daniel, it became a symbol of everything closing in around him: debt, exhausted soil, broken machinery, and a future growing smaller by the day. He had no money for a major investment. He had no access to better land. And he had almost no time left. The only resource arriving in abundance was the one nobody wanted: the endless stream of fibrous waste beside his field. Daniel did not yet know how it could help him. But as his options disappeared, he began looking at that mountain differently. Rain fell for 3 days without stopping. By the 4th morning, the dirt road had become a strip of mud, the drainage ditches were overflowing, and the mountain of Bagasse beside Daniel's field had sagged under its own weight. He walked toward it in old rubber boots, intending only to check whether the runoff had reached the southern field. He expected another problem. Instead, he found something he could not explain. Near the base of the pile, several pale shapes were pushing through the dark, soaked fibers. At first, Daniel thought they were scraps of paper or pieces of plastic caught in the waste. He crouched, reached into the warm bagasse, and pulled the top layer aside. Small mushroom caps appeared beneath his hand. They were smooth and light gray, clustered tightly together. Around them, thin white strands spread through the cane fibers like a web hidden under the surface. Daniel stared at them. He had seen mushrooms on fallen logs and rotting tree stumps. He had never seen them growing from waste dumped by a sugar mill. He pulled back another layer. The white network continued deeper into the pile. In some places, it had bound the loose fibers together. The material beneath the surface felt softer and warmer than the dry bagasse above it. It no longer looked like a lifeless heap. Something was feeding on it. Something was changing it. Daniel picked up a handful and squeezed. Brown water ran between his fingers, but the fibers held together in a way they had not before. The waste was beginning to break down, not simply rot. For several minutes, Daniel remained beside the pile, watching steam rise into the cold morning air. The discovery was small. A few mushrooms, a web of white threads. Nothing anyone else would have considered important. But Daniel had spent months watching every useful thing on his farm disappear. Now, for the first time, he was looking at something growing where nothing valuable was supposed to grow. He carried a bucket of the damp bagasse back to the barn. He did not yet know what kind of mushroom it was. He did not know whether it could be cultivated. He did not know whether it was worth anything at all. But he knew one thing. The mountain beside his field was not as dead as everyone believed. For the next several days, Daniel treated the corner of the barn like a laboratory. He had no proper equipment, no training in mushroom cultivation, and no money to waste. All he had were a few buckets of bagasse, an old thermometer, several empty feed sacks, and the question that had taken hold of him after the rain. Could this waste become a growing medium? Daniel began reading everything he could find. He learned that sugarcane bagasse was made mostly of tough plant fibers. Those fibers were difficult for most crops to use directly, but certain fungi could break them down. The idea sounded simple. The reality was not. Fresh bagasse held too much moisture in some places and dried too quickly in others. It could heat up as it decomposed. If handled poorly, unwanted molds and bacteria could take over before mushroom mycelium had a chance to spread. Daniel realized that the mushrooms he had found outside were not proof of an easy fortune. They were proof of possibility. He started with a small batch. He spread the bagasse in a thin layer, allowed excess water to drain, then packed it loosely into several sacks. He kept them in the coolest part of the barn and checked them every morning. At first, nothing happened. Then faint white strands began appearing between the fibers. Daniel recognized them immediately. They looked like the network he had seen in the rain-soaked pile. Over the next few days, the white growth spread farther. The loose fibers slowly began to bind together. What had once felt like a pile of dead plant waste now seemed to be turning into a living system. Still, Daniel remained cautious. He knew that not every mushroom could grow well on bagasse alone. Some might require a different moisture level, additional nutrients, cleaner handling, or a better balance of air and temperature. So he did not think about millions. He thought about one successful sack, one crop he could hold in his hands, one piece of evidence strong enough to prove that the sugar mill's waste had value. As he stood in the dim barn, watching the white threads move through the bagasse, Daniel finally understood what others had missed. The sugar had been removed from the cane, but the structure that remained was not empty. It was food for something else. Daniel believed he had finally found the answer. The white mycelium spreading through the first sacks looked strong. Each morning, he checked the fibers, adjusted the covers, and watched the pale network grow deeper into the bagasse. For the first time in months, the barn no longer felt like a place filled with old tools and empty stalls. It felt like the beginning of something. Encouraged by the progress, Daniel moved too quickly. He filled more sacks using fresh bagasse from the pile outside. He packed some too tightly, left others too wet, and placed nearly all of them together in the warmest corner of the barn. He had not yet learned how easily excess heat and contamination could ruin an entire batch. Within days, the smell changed. The sweet, earthy scent he had hoped for was replaced by something sharp and sour. Green patches appeared on the surface of several sacks. In others, the fibers turned slimy and dark. Daniel opened one bag and immediately knew something was wrong. The white growth had stopped. A thick layer of unwanted mold had taken over. He tried to save the batch by removing the damaged material, but the contamination had already spread. One sack after another collapsed into a wet, foul-smelling mass. Nearly everything was lost. Word traveled quickly. A neighbor who had seen Daniel carrying bagasse into the barn laughed when he heard about the failure. "You are trying to grow food in factory trash," he said. "What did you expect?" Daniel said nothing. That evening, he dragged the spoiled sacks outside and emptied them into a pit behind the barn. Weeks of effort disappeared in less than an hour. The loss was not large in money, but it was enormous in hope. For a moment, Daniel wondered whether the mushrooms after the rain had been nothing more than an accident. Perhaps the bagasse was not an opportunity. Perhaps it was exactly what everyone had said it was: waste. Then he cut open the final sack. Most of it was ruined, but near the center, protected beneath a cooler layer of fiber, a small patch of healthy white mycelium remained. Daniel knelt beside it. The experiment had failed. Yet hidden inside that failure was a clue. The problem was not necessarily the bagasse. The problem might have been the way he had handled it. Daniel did not throw away the surviving patch of white mycelium. Instead, he treated it like evidence. He carried the final sack to a cooler corner of the barn and began comparing it with the failed ones. The difference was not dramatic, but it was enough to point him in a new direction. The healthy section was less compact. It was damp but not soaked. And unlike the bags that had overheated, it still had small pockets of air between the fibers. Daniel began to understand that growing mushrooms was not simply a matter of filling sacks with bagasse and waiting. The material had to be prepared so that the mushroom mycelium could spread before competing organisms took control. He slowed down. First, he stopped using fresh bagasse straight from the outdoor pile. He spread it in thin layers and allowed excess moisture and heat to escape. Then he experimented with smaller batches so that one mistake would not destroy everything. He also cleaned the work area more carefully. The old feed sacks were replaced or washed. His tools were scrubbed. He separated new batches from damaged ones instead of stacking everything together. Next came the hardest part, learning the right moisture level. Too dry, and the mycelium would struggle to spread. Too wet, and the fibers would become heavy, airless, and vulnerable to contamination. Daniel began squeezing handfuls of prepared bagasse before filling each sack. He wanted the material moist enough to hold together, but not so wet that water streamed from his fist. He also packed the sacks more loosely. This time, air could move through the fibers. Days passed. Then the familiar white threads returned, but now they spread more evenly. Instead of appearing in isolated patches, the mycelium moved steadily through the bagasse, binding the fibers into firm, pale blocks. The sour smell was gone. In its place came a mild, earthy scent. Daniel recorded every change in a notebook: how wet the material felt, where each sack had been placed, how long the white growth took to appear. He was no longer guessing blindly. He was building a process. Several weeks later, small clusters began forming near openings in the sacks. Daniel watched as they expanded into recognizable mushroom caps. They were not large. They were not perfect, but they were real. For the first time, Daniel held a crop grown from the sugar mill's discarded fiber. The mountain outside had not yet become a gold mine, but one small sack had finally proven that it could. Daniel harvested the mushrooms before sunrise. There were only a few clusters, growing from the openings he had cut into the sacks, but to him they looked more valuable than anything else in the barn. Their caps were firm, their color was clean, and they carried the mild, earthy smell he had been waiting for. He placed them carefully into 2 wooden crates. The harvest was too small for a distributor and too uncertain for a formal contract, so Daniel drove to the local farmer's market. At first, he did not know what price to ask. He arranged the mushrooms beside a handwritten sign, grown locally using recycled sugarcane fiber. Most shoppers slowed down because of the sign before they noticed the mushrooms. Some asked whether they were safe. Others wanted to know how waste from a sugar mill could produce food. Daniel explained that the bagasse was not used as it came from the factory. It had to be prepared, managed for moisture, and kept clean enough for the mushroom mycelium to grow through it. He did not claim the process was perfect. He simply told them what he had learned. A restaurant owner named Maria stopped at the table and inspected the mushrooms closely. She broke one cap, smelled it, and asked Daniel when it had been harvested. "This morning," he said. She bought half the first crate. Within an hour, the rest was gone. Daniel stood behind the empty table holding a small stack of bills. It was not a fortune. It was not enough to pay the bank. But it was the first money the bagasse had ever earned him. More important, customers had not only purchased the mushrooms, they had purchased the story behind them. A local farmer turning discarded material into fresh food. The following week, Maria called and asked whether he could supply a larger amount. Daniel looked across the barn at the few healthy sacks still producing. "Not yet," he answered, "but soon." That evening, he opened his notebook and calculated the cost of each batch. The bagasse itself was nearly free. His largest expenses were labor, preparation, growing supplies, and the losses caused by contamination. For the first time, the numbers did not end in disaster. They showed a narrow path forward. Daniel placed the market money inside the same drawer that held the bank notices. The amount was small, but it changed the meaning of everything. The pile beside his field was no longer just waste. It had produced something people were willing to pay for. The first sale did not make Daniel successful. It made him careful. He knew one good market morning could disappear as quickly as it had arrived. If he wanted to supply Maria's restaurant and reach more customers, he needed more than a few healthy sacks in the corner of an old barn. He needed consistency. Daniel began by dividing the barn into separate areas. One section was used for preparing the bagasse. Another was kept for newly filled sacks. The coolest, cleanest part became the growing room. He stopped mixing fresh batches with older ones. He also began labeling every sack with the date, moisture level, and preparation method. If a batch failed, he wanted to know why. If one performed well, he wanted to repeat it. The process was slow, but the results became more predictable. Soon, Daniel was harvesting enough mushrooms to deliver small weekly orders to Maria. She introduced him to another restaurant owner who wanted locally grown produce with an unusual story. Then a grocery shop placed a trial order. Daniel still worked alone most days, but he could no longer manage every step by himself. He hired a local teenager to help clean equipment and prepare sacks after school. A few weeks later, he brought in a neighbor for 2 mornings each week during harvest. The same people who had laughed at the idea now watched trucks carry empty crates away from the farm. Daniel also approached the sugar mill. For years, the mill had treated the bagasse beside his field as a disposal problem. Daniel proposed something different, a regular collection arrangement. He would take selected loads, provided they were delivered separately and kept free from unwanted debris. The mill agreed. It reduced the mess around his field and gave Daniel a steadier supply of raw material. But the biggest improvement came after harvest. At first, Daniel had dumped the used growing material behind the barn. Over time, he noticed it was softer and darker than the original bagasse. The mushroom mycelium had already begun breaking down the tough fibers. Instead of throwing it away, he mixed it into compost piles and applied small amounts to damaged parts of the southern field. The The waste had now entered a cycle. The sugar mill discarded the fiber. The mushrooms turned part of it into food. The remaining material returned to the soil. Daniel was no longer operating a desperate experiment. He was building a system in which one discarded material created several forms of value. For years, the sugar mill had treated Daniel's land as the easiest place to leave what it no longer wanted. The relationship had always been one-sided. The mill produced the waste. Daniel lived with the smell, the runoff, and the growing piles beside his fields. But now, the trucks were no longer arriving without a plan. Daniel had rules. The bagasse had to be delivered on schedule. Loads contaminated with plastic, oil, or other debris would be rejected. The freshest material had to be separated from older, partially decomposed piles. At first, the mill manager resisted. "You used to take whatever we brought," he said. "I used to think it had no value," Daniel replied. That answer changed the conversation. By then, Daniel's mushroom operation had become visible beyond the local market. Restaurants were placing repeat orders. A regional food distributor had begun asking about supply capacity. The mill could see that the fiber it had once discarded was helping create a product with real market value. Soon, Daniel was invited to the mill office. This time, he was not there to complain about the dumping. He was there to negotiate. The mill wanted a formal agreement. It needed a reliable way to reduce disposal pressure, while Daniel needed consistent, cleaner raw material. Daniel agreed, but only under conditions that protected his operation. The deliveries would be documented. The material would be kept separate, and the mill would help cover part of the transportation cost. The same company that had once treated his farm like a convenient dumping ground was now asking him to become a business partner. News spread quickly through the community. The neighbors who had laughed at his first failed sacks began asking questions. Some wanted jobs. Others wanted to know whether different agricultural wastes could also support mushroom production. Daniel answered carefully. He knew bagasse was not magic. It only worked because he had learned how to prepare it, manage contamination, and build a reliable system around it. The reversal was not that waste had suddenly become valuable. The value had always been there. What changed was that someone had learned how to use it. As Daniel watched the next truck unload a clean, carefully separated load beside the barn, he remembered the uncontrolled mountain that had once frightened him. The same material still lay before him, but the power around it had changed hands. 5 years after the first mushrooms appeared in the rain-soaked bagasse, Daniel's farm no longer looked like a place waiting to fail. The old barn had been expanded into a clean growing facility. Rows of mushroom blocks filled temperature-controlled rooms. Workers moved between harvesting tables, packing stations, and compost bays. Every week, crates left the farm for restaurants, grocery stores, and regional distributors. Daniel's business had grown far beyond the 2 wooden crates he once carried to the local market. The mushrooms became the main product, but they were not the only source of value. The spent growing material was composted and returned to the fields. Soil that once hardened under the sun began holding moisture longer. Organic matter slowly increased. The southern field, once considered nearly useless, started producing again. Daniel also began selling prepared compost to nearby growers. Farmers who had once mocked his experiments now paid for material made from the same bagasse they had called garbage. The farm created jobs. It reduced waste from the sugar mill. It produced food. And it helped rebuild damaged soil. Reporters later described the operation as a $1 million mushroom business. They focused on the revenue, the expansion, and the unlikely rise of a farmer who had nearly lost everything. But Daniel understood the story differently. The real discovery had not been a secret type of mushroom. It had not been a miracle hidden inside one pile of waste. The discovery was a way of seeing. The sugar mill had looked at bagasse and seen a disposal cost. The neighbors had seen odor, insects, and embarrassment. Daniel had eventually learned to see carbon, structure, growing material, compost, and a system that could create value more than once. One evening, he stood beside the southern field as another harvest truck left the farm. The mountain of uncontrolled waste was gone. In its place were organized stacks of clean bagasse waiting to be processed. Daniel picked up a handful of the dry fiber and let it fall slowly through his fingers. He had spent years believing the farm's future depended on finding something valuable beneath the soil. Oil, water, better land. But the gold mine had never been underground. It had been lying beside his field all along, waiting for someone to stop calling it waste.